It's a beautiful winter day in New York. Thanks so much to everybody for coming. We have almost 400 people here this morning, which is a testament to the drawing power of the Sun King, I guess. You know, pretty amazing. I'm Gregory Long. I'm the president of the New York Botanical Garden. It's been my honor to be in that position for some time, and there are many, many friends here, friends of long standing. It's so nice to see you, and many new faces too. Thanks so much for coming this morning. This is our 16th annual winter lecture series. Winter mornings are great times for gardeners to get out of the garden and come into the Ross Hall to learn about garden history and about gardening all over the world. As you know, this is a series of talks about the French garden. Some of you were here a couple of weeks ago for Louis Benesch, and I hope some of you will come back in a couple of weeks for Robert Mallet. The brochure is at the door in case you haven't seen that yet. But this morning, we have a very special event, very special friend of the garden and speaker, Alexandre de Vogüé. As many of you may know, Alexandre and his family are the 5th generations owners of Vaux le Vicomte, which is the largest private property to be listed as a French national landmark, monument historique. The gardens at Vaux le Vicomte are, of course, an early masterwork of André Le Nôtre, who went on to fame and glory at Versailles, but many people think these gardens at Vaux le Vicomte are really his masterpiece. I think I do, for example. Alexandre and his family have been involved in the restoration and the maintenance of this incredibly important garden now for all of these generations. And Alexandre is going to tell you a little bit about the trials and tribulations and pleasures of that maintenance. How many of you have been to Vaux le Vicomte? Look at that, Alexandre.
I like that.
And everybody else wants to go, right? So everybody in this room has either been there or is dying to go. So with no more talk from me, please welcome our guest, Alexandre de Vogüé.
Well, thank you very much, Gregory, for this very kind word. Thank you very much for this great invitation. Of course, it's an honor for me to speak in front of you. Good morning, everyone. And it's an honor because I am in an iconic place of gardening, the New York Botanical Garden. Not as old as Vaux le Vicomte, but I mean, it is definitely a very important place for which I'm very, again, honored to be here in front of you to present you a few slides and a few images about Le Nôtre first. So let me just, so that's the title. So yeah, I'm going to, this is more or less the plan that I'm going to try to follow during this presentation. And of course, we're going to begin to introduce the character of Le Nôtre, his background, of course, and his first works that are going to lead little by little to Vaux le Vicomte, his masterpiece. Le Nôtre and Vaux le Vicomte are two landmarks extremely important in the history of garden, and Vaux le Vicomte is as important in the career of André Le Nôtre, and that's what I'm going to try to explain it to you why. I have a short video to present you for the few of yours that haven't been to Vaux le Vicomte. So some images of Vaux and what we are doing with a brief summary of the history of Nicolas Foucquet, the owner of Vaux le Vicomte. I will then go to what I call the resurrection, because it was definitely a resurrection that my great-grandfather, Mr. Alfred Sommier, took over when he bought the place in 1875, and there have been some absolutely huge, major work in the garden. And then I'll talk about today, the challenges, the opportunities, the privilege, the huge privilege that we as a family have by being at the place we are now, and the different projects that we are handling in 2015 and 2016. Before beginning the presentation, I would like to just do a little detailed information about the language. I might use classic or classical garden and I might also use French formal garden. For information, French formal garden is an expression that has been, which is, I think, the most well-known expression to describe the classic and the regular garden, but it's an expression that came out just in the very end of the 19th century. So I might talk about the French formal garden, even if I'm talking about the 17th century garden of Vaux le Vicomte. So thanks to anniversaries. Anniversaries are important for research because it's an opportunity for scholars, for universities, scientists to develop the research about a character and hear about Le Nôtre. And we had two very important anniversaries. We had the 300th anniversary of the death of Le Nôtre in 2000. And then 2 years ago, we celebrate his 400th anniversary of his birth. And that allowed some scientists and some researchers to know way more about Le Nôtre, and above all, to break the kind of myth that there were around his personnage. And we'll go through a few of them. His achievement, of course, that were also not as well known as one could imagine, as some new gardens that disappeared today, but were found out to be on the hand of André Le Nôtre. And of course, the success that he had actually from the work that he did at Vaux le Vicomte, and that was, again, a very important date from which Le Nôtre, after the Vaux le Vicomte work, was going to be internationally renowned and asked by the most powerful people of the second half of the century, of the 17th century in Europe, to have their own garden designed by Le Nôtre. So Le Nôtre, at one point, you know, he began his education at Simon Vougué workshop, a famous painter of the beginning of the 17th century. And some people thought, you know, he's going to be an architect, he's going to be a painter. He was going to be a gardener. And there's absolutely no doubt about this question, as he was born in a little house on the northwest corner of the Tuileries. So it's hidden here, but the house is not existing anymore, doesn't exist anymore. But he was born in the middle of a garden. His father was a gardener. His mother was the daughter of a gardener. So and then at this time, when you were born in this kind of family, both of your parents were doing the maximum for you to become a gardener. So there was absolutely no question for Le Nôtre to be an architect, which even if I think, and you'll see later in the presentation, that I think he is more of an architect, of a landscape architect than a gardener. So his parents and his education, very broad education, is going to bring little by little Le Nôtre to just become a very simple gardener, and then later onto this iconic landscape designer. So at the time, it was very normal and very classic to have a very broad, very extensive, very wide kind of education. Even if his parents were definitely sure about the destiny of their son, it was important at the time to have a very broad education about all arts. And yes, he began to learn painting and have his first thoughts and first images of perspective at Simon Vougué workshop. Simon Vougué was a very modern and innovative kind of painter. He had traveled to Rome. He came back, was the official painter under Louis XIII, and he had in his workshop Le Nôtre as a student. He had also François Mansart, the famous architect, and he had Lebrun. So the painter Lebrun, the future amazing gardener, landscape designer Le Nôtre, met for the first time when they were 18, 19 years old at Simon Vougué workshop in the Louvre. So he's got this first kind of impressions of what is a painting, what is two-dimension image, what is three-dimension image, that he's going to develop a little bit later. He's going to learn architecture with François Mansart mainly, and that it's the new research that show also that he was a great friend of Jacques Lemercier, with whom he's going to work in different projects. But again, he's going to have this broad education in order to have an understanding of what is art, what is beauty, what is coherence in an ensemble as a garden or in an ensemble as a painting. And of course, horticulture with his father in the garden of the Tuileries. He might have worked as a kid helping his father in the Tuileries. And yes, there, at that time, he was this simple gardener. And when I say simple, I have, of course, a huge admiration and respect for the gardener of today, for the gardener of yesterday. He began as a gardener, but he very soon was going to become more, again, of an architect than a gardener. He was a curieux. So I said a curious mind, but in French, a curieux in the 17th century was Nicolas Fouquet, that I will tell you about later. But Nicolas Fouquet and Le Nôtre were this kind of character that were interested about a lot of different art, a lot of different sciences. And he was interested, and that was thanks to the archives that we have about his library. He had a very extensive library, and he had books about pretty much everything. But look at the two last points, arithmetic and geometry. And that was, of course, going to be key elements and key knowledge for the gardener Le Nôtre, who, even if he was a very young gardener, he was beginning to understand and to have the control on all those sciences that were going to help him a lot, of course, in his later work. So first, of course, and that's been the case all the way through the work of Vaux le Vicomte, Le Nôtre was going to work mainly on already existing garden. And he was going to maintain this garden, to restore those gardens, but he's not going to create much during his first works. But look at with who he's working. He's working with Gaston d'Orléans, the Louis XIII brother. So it's already a position that one might think that it got this position thanks to the broad members of the family that were involved into gardening, but that were involved at the very highest level, as his father was the gardener of the king at the Tuileries and in charge of the Tuileries. So all this connection would made possible for him to get in touch with the highest personage characters of the state, and the reason why he was chosen by Gaston de France. 1635, he's 22 years old, and he's going to take care of both of those gardens, the Luxembourg and Saint-Cloud. He will go back to Saint-Cloud some 20 years later, 25 years later, but to make there some very important creative work, especially around water features. I just want to come back here. Here we are in 1635, first half of the 17th century, and there is still this very great influence of the medieval and even Renaissance garden. A garden is made to be seen from the first floor of the house, the noble. So I say house, which is a little bit, it's a chateau. Okay, but I mean the English likes to use this very simple and modest word as house. So I might have this habit also. Sorry about that. So the noble floor of the chateau is the first floor because it's the best view to have a look at the garden. And the garden were designed to be just looked at from the first floor of the chateau, and not really to have a stroll and to really live in the garden and spend some time in the garden. And we have here what the main characteristic of those gardens is that those gardens are closed by a wall or by hedges. And there is no openings towards the outside, which is going to be the great strength of Le Nôtre. We're going to see that later. So here we can see there's always those very squared, usually parterre. There are no coherence between one with each other. And we have here, I don't see very well here actually, but we have here the hedge. So there's usually a hedge with also a line of tree that really make the boundary very strong and very, the limit of the garden. And you are in a closed environment. Same thing here in Saint-Cloud, in front of her house. We have two parterres, embroidery in the middle, basin, a water basin in the middle, and that's pretty much it. It was the fashion at the time. You'll see that with the Le Nôtre, it's going to change a great deal. I'm not going to be able to talk about all the work of Le Nôtre before Vaux le Vicomte, but there is here a very important one, unfortunately, that disappeared during the 18th century, late 18th century after the Revolution. It's the Garden of Gagny. And here we can realize that things are changing little by little. First of all, the parterres are getting much greater, much longer. There is a succession of different parterres in front of the house. First one, typically, we are close to the chateau, and it is very detailed. And here you have the embroidery, boxwood, you have statues that are very detailed, and because it's just the first level from the chateau, so people are very, gardeners and landscape designers, even if that word definitely doesn't exist at that time, but they are designing on a very precise scale and detail the first part of this garden. And then when you go further along, you then have less details, and even less detail here, we have just a big rectangle of grass, with the two here basins. So the big change here is you have the house in the middle of the setting, along a big axe, along a central axis that goes all along the garden, with, again, a garden that ends here, with water features, but it stops, and there's no, we have a very clear boundary here, a very clear limit to the eye, and a very clear limit to the walk. But the new thing is the axis, is the scale, and it's the long rectangular parterre. And here we have a clear introduction about perspective. Here we're going to have also the width of the alleys that are going to slightly change. So it's going, I'm not going to go into details, but basically when you are looking from the chateau, you have two possibilities depending on what the gardener or the architect wants to show you, or to show to the guest. It's or you want the garden to feel more, smaller than it is in the reality, or vice versa. And he's going to play with the width of the alley, with the width of the trees in between the alleys, to make this sensation that or it's going to be a very wide and long garden, or a very short one. And I'll go into more details when we talk about Vaux le Vicomte. But Gagny is definitely an important garden in the story of French formal garden and in the career of André Le Nôtre. The second one, we are here in 1643, and Le Nôtre is appointed by Louis XIII of the main and official drawer of all the plans and parterres for the royal garden. So this is very important. He's still young, but he's been having this rise in his career, and people really like him. He's good. He's more and more well known in France. He's becoming the main gardener of the kingdom, and this is going to continue. There's been some descriptions about Le Nôtre of being this simple gardener, very humble, and staying in his garden. He is a very important character in the society of the king, first Louis XIII and then Louis XIV. And he's very quickly going to step back from the day-to-day operations in the garden to really make some drawings and to think about the overall picture of a garden, to have an amazing vision about the landscape and how the future garden should be, and then draw plans, and then he will go to another project. Anyway, let's go back to the Le Rincy. Le Rincy, again, disappeared after the Revolution. It was the property, the estate of Jacques Bordier, an important finance character under Louis XIII. And there is so many similarities with Vaux le Vicomte that we can say that it's a training kind of sheet for the three main artists that are going to work also at Vaux le Vicomte. Here we're talking about what I will call the dream team: Le Vaux, the architect, Lebrun, the painter, and Le Nôtre. They all have more or less the same age, around 40 years old, between 40 and 44 years old at the time of Vaux le Vicomte, so much later than that. They are 25 at that time, and they are going to be gathered for the first time at Le Rincy. And let me just show you the next slide, which is Vaux le Vicomte. So here we find again the main characteristics that we're going to find in all French formal garden. A main central axis along which all the setting is going to be organized, with the domination definitely of the chateau. Here in Vaux le Vicomte we have a 3 miles axis along which everything is going to get organized, centered with the chateau in the middle. Then we're going to have the beginning of transversal axis and opening throughout the landscape. And this is absolutely key with the work of Le Nôtre. Le Rincy, the main chateau, the moat, and the beginning of the garden in front of the house, where here we have two possibilities. Or it is a work in progress, and Jacques Bordier is going to buy some other land to continue, but there is apparently through the archives a more thing that it's more sure to say that apparently, and that's how it's been destroyed after the revolution, the garden just stopped here. Nevertheless, we're going to have those transversal axes. First, at the base of the chateau, transversal axis. Second one here with an opening, a typical opening of the 17th century, opening towards different bosquets. And then we have the same secondary axis with water feature here, etc. So we have here with Le Rincy definitely a work and I would say a training for Vaux le Vicomte, because it's still at a very humble scale at Le Rincy. But we have those three people for the first time working together, and look at the similarity. It is quite amazing. The big difference with Vaux le Vicomte, the scale and the water feature, where we have here the canal and these two main axes, perpendicular axis, into which Le Nôtre is going to design the whole. Le Nôtre and Le Vaux are going to design the whole rest of the property. North, south, south axis, east, west axis by La Poile, the canal, which is actually here a river that is going to be canalized during the work of Le Nôtre and Le Vaux during the 1650s. So here we have, just before the Fronde is this civil war that is going to last a little bit less than 10 years in France. And we have a Le Nôtre that already show his great assets. He's got this exceptional memory and mainly, of course, visual. And I think that those 3 points is a resume of what are the strengths and the vision and the genius of Le Nôtre. It's this ability to arrive on a site and to have, without any drawings or anything, just about his vision, to understand the difficulty and the different space and volume of the actual landscape on which he's going to design the future garden. And it's Patricia Bouchenaud-Deschamps who wrote this pretty fantastic biography, the pretty unique and only very official biography about Le Nôtre that came out during 2013, the anniversary of the birth of Le Nôtre. And she found out actually by studying the very few pieces of our archive that we have from Le Nôtre. She found out by studying the spelling, the writing, that he had dyslexia. And the fact of having dyslexia is that he has this amazing power of being able to visualize in his head, mentally visualize a three-dimensional scheme. And this is going to be really, I think, and she thinks, the great ability and the great genius of Le Nôtre. Despite of one can imagine about the huge work and the huge garden that he has been designed, he was very concerned about cost, because he knew that if he was going to have a hugely costly work, then his patron might not be very happy with him, even if those patrons have a lot of money, of course, definitely. But he was really working on the landscape of that he had in front of him. So I would like to go back just here. Here, we can't really see it very clearly, but at Vaux le Vicomte, there is a hill. And here there is a hill. Actually, I'm going to see it, watch it on the next one, I think, on the very next one. Before going to Vaux le Vicomte, I would like just to point out some, of course, very iconic and important, crucial books that have been written and that show that the French formal garden or the classic garden didn't came out of the ground at Vaux le Vicomte or at de Rincy. Of course, garden, it's a slow evolution, and this evolution began in Italy, in France, at the very end of the 16th century, with some different items, different specifications, different characteristics that will then be gathered for the first time and at this huge scale at Vaux le Vicomte. But it began very slowly in the last 50 years that precede Vaux le Vicomte. And Jacques Boisseau de la Baudry, he began to theorize the art of gardening, and those books definitely show that gardening was put as an art, and it was the first time in history. Antoine-Joseph Desalliés d'Argenville, this is the Bible. This is the Bible for French formal garden. It has been written around the end of the 17th century, beginning of 18th century, and it's been published after the death of Le Nôtre. But he actually takes absolutely all the rules, all the techniques, and all the theory that Le Nôtre put up in his garden into this book. I encourage you, if you have a possibility, to have a look at those images and illustration of the books, and you'll see how the evolution, the very evolution in a few pages of the parterres, of the water features, of the main characteristic of a French formal garden that begin again with the medieval garden closed towards the very open French formal garden of the mid-17th century. So finally, here I would like to tell you about the Vaux le Vicomte land. We are in 1639, so 2 years before Foucquet buys his land from his father. Because this same Patricia Bouchenaud-Deschamps find a proof that Le Nôtre was present alongside of Nicolas Fouquet in 1639, 2 years before he buys the land. And that means that Fouquet had already 20 years before the achievement of his estate, a huge idea, a huge project for himself, as he had the greatest gardener on his side to give him some ideas and some thoughts about the land he was going to buy. Le Nôtre actually put a gardener in the village of Mancy, which is a little village next to Vaux le Vicomte, in order to begin to work with Foucquet. So Foucquet buys the land in 1641, and in 1641 there is this unknown architect called Daniel Gittard. And Daniel Gittard was born in the neighboring village of Blandy-les-Tours. And he's next to Foucquet, next to Le Nôtre, and he might, we don't have a very precise archive on that matter, but he might have begun to do the first surveys, the first land surveys on the future, about the future garden and the future estate of Vaux le Vicomte. Then there is the Fronde, and nothing is going to happen during this period of time. In 1652, Fouquet is back onto the estate with Daniel Gittard, with very probably the dream team, Le Nôtre, Le Brun, and Le Vaux. The first big work that they have to do is this river. So we have here the line of the future chateau, the line of the future garden, and we have a few hamlets here that Fouquet, very simply, is going to get rid of. He's going to get rid of, he's going to employ all the inhabitants of the hamlet into the realization of his great dream. So that was the way at the time, I guess. Then he had this river, and Le Nôtre and probably Le Vaux, they were going to work hand in hand there. They had thought about a north-south chateau and axis, and so that was the first axis. And here is the second axis, which is the river. But there is this Rue Bobet, which is the name of this little stream that is cutting the future estate. They are very simply going to canalize the river into a tunnel that is going to run on the east part of the estate, and that is going to end up into the river Ancueil. This is the Ancueil River. So basically, they're going to get rid of this river to have a free and virgin landscape for them to work on. On this map, we can see also the hills. There is a hill here with a slope. There is a hill here where you had a medieval castle around this area. So there's a slope here, and you have a valley here in which the river is running. So you can imagine we are here in the middle of the woods, fields, in the countryside of Paris. Paris is 30 miles south, Vaux le Vicomte, sorry, is 30 miles southeast of Paris, strategically placed between two royal residences, Vincennes on the east outskirts of Paris, and Fontainebleau just southeast of Vaux le Vicomte. And Le Nôtre is arriving there, and he has to, as I was telling you earlier on, to visualize how he's going to have this great garden, taking into account the relief of the terrain, which is not easy. We've got a valley, we've got two hills, we've got a second valley here, and he's going to do this amazing job by moving some earth, but when he's going to move some earth to one place, he's going to dig and make a terrace on the next to it, and not then having to move the earth very, very far away. And 20 years later, this is how it looked like. So I'll go into more details with pictures a little bit later, But we realize, and Le Nôtre realized here, that yes, he was waiting for this private patron, private order, and above all, this virgin landscape. And the three L, Le Vaux, Le Nôtre, and Le Brun, had from Fouquet what any artist would dream of: a virgin landscape blank page to create on, a lot of money from their patron, and freedom. And I think this is the vision and the genius of Fouquet. He gave his artists a lot of freedom at two conditions: that they were as bold and audacious as possible, and also that they were as innovative as possible. This is the reason why Vaux le Vicomte is a landmark on garden history. There's here absolutely all the characteristics that I was telling you about that were created but separated and isolated on different gardens throughout the first half of the 17th century. And Le Nôtre, thanks to his experience, is going to give the best of himself, the best of his knowledge and expertise to gather all those characteristics into one single place. Vaux le Vicomte then become a model because Fouquet is also distributing engravings of Israël Sylvestre everywhere. And he's already this communication person that is going to show off pretty much his influence, his power, and his wealth by distributing and by communicating on his masterpiece of Vaux le Vicomte. And very quickly, Le Nôtre is going to be asked by the most powerful characters of Europe at that time to have a garden designed by him. Versailles, of course, is the first one, and we're going to see a little bit later on how that happened. I'll go here into some characteristic and main characteristic of the garden, but I think André Le Nôtre is very right when he says that the eye creates perspective, but walking makes it alive. And this is an invitation that Le Nôtre is giving you to have a walk in the garden. We're not in a medieval garden anymore. He actually says about embroidery boxwood, those parterres that are just in front of the house, he actually says that they are done and designed for the nourrice, the ladies who are taking care of the children, that stays in the first floor with the children, and they can have a nice look at the embroidery boxwood. Le Nôtre is way more interested about long perspectives, long parterres, and optical illusions. So this is a picture that is taken from the south terrace of the chateau. And there is this first optical illusion that we think that the grotto are extremely close and that are on the same level at the mirror of water, which is the last pool of water in the background. And what Le Nôtre is, I think, trying to say there is that when we are at the foot of the chateau, we have a painting in front of us. We have a 2D painting. And there is a lot of things that we don't see on the painting, and that we have to go into the garden to really realize all the surprises and the kind of 3D dimensional garden that actually is in front of us. But we have to walk and we have to find out about all the surprises by walking in the garden. It is also, we have to realize that at this time there's been many, it was a bubbling scientific period of time where a lot of invention of Galilei, the lunettes of Galilei, Copernic, the place of the Earth in the universe, everything was found out, and people didn't really know and were fighting and were burned in terms of, depending on their religion, depending on their belief. And Le Nôtre might say that be wary of your own beliefs. You are at the foot of the chateau, you think Hercule Farnèse, which is the statue at the very end of the garden, is very close, but maybe not. Be careful what you think. Have a walk in the garden and you'll see how your senses have been fooled by all those optical illusions. So I think there can be a very interesting research that I think doesn't exist so far in the comparison between the history of art, the history of garden, and the history of sciences. But I'm not here, and I don't have the knowledge to do that anyway. So here, again, Le Nôtre is using all his broad education, his knowledge. He was great in mathematics, great in geometry, of course. And there is this law of Descartes that I'm not going to go into depth because it's pretty much explained here, but basically that the angle that is shown from the chateau, and if you stand on the southern side of the water, so if you're here, and you have the same angle reflecting on the water, so basically you're at your feet, you have the reflection of the chateau at your feet, despite that the chateau is 500 meters away. And we are in the 17th century, and you have to realize what a surprise that could be for people. And it is still a pretty amazing surprise if you walk there and you have this reflection on a quiet morning. The water, of course, is a crucial element in the French formal garden, in the classic garden. And Vaux le Vicomte has this chance of having a lot of water around the estate. This versus, for example, Versailles, who had a lot of difficulty and who invent many different huge machines to try to get some water for the water features of Versailles. Vaux le Vicomte was lucky enough to have a spring at the very north part of the estate, some other spring at the south part of the estate, and a huge reservoir that is going to be just here below Hercule Farnèse. There's a 170 meters long subterranean reservoir of water with two aqueducts that are going into a V shape to two different directions and that are capturing water of the rain through the land and through the stone of those aqueducts. This is 17th century. This is still there at Vaux le Vicomte. There's still no pump and no electricity, and we are still using the same gravity system of two springs on two highest points of the estate, and with the pressure and the gravity, it feeds the fountains. So of course the fountains and the pipe had been replaced and restored by my great-great-grandfather, but the system is exactly the same, and this is to show how genius was this Le Nôtre. He knew that the element of the water and to have some water from one way to another was key for the realization of his garden. Foucquet bought some land at 6 kilometers, so 4 miles away, south from the estate, to have some drainage and to have some small trenches to bring water from lakes that were in that land south of the estate and to bring also this water towards his estate. What for? Just to have fountains, just to have the beauty of water lost forever. And that was also a sign of power, a sign of wealth, and he was showing that to the king, he was showing that to his friends. This is another characteristic, main characteristic of the Le Nôtre garden. It's this opening towards the landscape. The nature and the very wild nature is touching the very manicured nature and very designed nature. But when you walk at Vaux le Vicomte, you walk along the Grand Canal, and suddenly you step there, you look on the west part of the estate, and you see this medieval bridge and the nature around. I'm not going to, I mean, those are ideas, but of course there's no proof. But what about Le Nôtre wanting to show that from this manicured garden, you have a broad and amazing landscape, completely wild, which is still part of the estate of Nicolas Fouquet, again showing the influence and the wealth of Nicolas Fouquet, having an endless estate around him. But I like also the fact that we have a very pittoresque and very English garden right on the rim of the most powerful French formal garden ever. And this is a video that I'm going to launch here that is going to, and we'll talk then a bit more about Vaux le Vicomte and the work that my assessor did that I'm going to launch here by pushing on, I can't remember the button, I have to say, sorry. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
From 1641 to 1661, what will become the estate of Vaux le Vicomte slowly emerges from the earth 30 miles away from Paris. It is the fruit of a creative and passionate mind, Nicolas Fouquet, superintendent of finances under Louis XIV. To build his chateau, he hires three of the most famous artists of the Grand Siècle, the architect Louis Le Vaux, the gardener André Le Nôtre, and the painter Charles Lebrun. Louis XIV was so impressed that he decided to surround himself with the same artists to build the Château de Versailles. During an auction in 1875, a French wealthy industrialist named Alfred Saunier acquired the château and the garden of Vaux le Vicomte. He undertook many colossal works to restore the estate. This same commitment is passed on to his heirs, who still lovingly care for the property 5 generations later.
When the chateau was opened to the public in 1968, we were still living there. We were using the library as a living room. So we had to hide the toys and hide the TV that was on the piano and to make it a little bit more 17th century. That was a way for my parents to face expenses for the restoration and the maintenance of this space.
Vaux le Vicomte employs 70 employees for a domain that features 80 acres of French formal garden, 18 miles of hedges, and 12 miles of water pipelines to ensure water flow for the fountains. Fouquet is a great collector. He acquired many works of art, including paintings, sculptures, and fine furniture by some of the greatest artists of its time. Today, in order to develop the resources needed for such an estate, the Vogüé brothers offer to their visitors a vivid experience of Fouquet's time through numerous events. The famous soirée aux chandelles, during which the house and the garden are lit by more than 2,000 candles. The Journée Grand Siècle plunges the costumed visitor into the great atmosphere of the 17th century. For Christmas, the richly decorated chateau's rooms and the chimney fires create a magical environment. Vaux le Vicomte is also the scene of prestigious private events, company seminars, weddings, private receptions. After 350 years of history, the chateau and the garden of Vaux le Vicomte still offer a living experience of the Grand Siècle. Many people describe it as their favorite chateau in France because it offers a warm and intimate way to experience such historic grandeur.
So before continuing, I would like just to make a small historical parenthesis about the story of Fouquet and about a huge myth that I'm sure the huge majority of you still believes in. But it's very serious. So Fouquet gathered his team around him. He almost finished actually the estate, and in 17th of August 1661, he organized this huge party, absolutely admirable, where he invited the king and the court. And you all know that because of this party, the king was jealous and put Fouquet in prison. This is wrong. This is quite far from the reality. And if you read some biography of the last 20, 30 years about Fouquet, it's about very serious, I mean, from very serious historians, of course. The destiny of Fouquet was, of course, decided way before the party. Actually, 3 months before the party, two men, the king Louis XIV and Jean-Baptiste Colbert, decided to get rid of Fouquet and to organize a plot to get rid of this dangerous character. Colbert was the personal assistant, secretary of the ex-prime minister, the Cardinal Mazarin. The Cardinal Mazarin died on 6th of March 1661, and the position of prime minister is then free. And definitely, as a minister of finance, Fouquet is definitely looking at that with a lot of envy. Colbert also is looking at that position. And Colbert, for a few years before the party, is going to try to convince the king that Fouquet is one of those dangerous, noble, dangerous, powerful men that tried to overthrow him during the civil war, during the war. And during the war, when there was those thing happening in Paris, the king had to flee when he was 6 years old to Saint-Germain, and he was traumatized by this experience. So when he hears Colbert telling him about this wealthy and thief of Fouquet, he's suddenly quite scared of having to deal with this kind of character, and he believes Colbert, and they both are going to organize this plot to get rid of Fouquet. To be clear, Fouquet was this minister of finance, and he saved the crown by financing the crown thanks to his friend. He had a great number of financial friends around him that he was asking some huge amount of money to lend to the crown, recuperating, of course, a huge interest rate in the middle. So this is quite of a scandal today. It was definitely not at the time. Colbert did actually way more than Fouquet for himself and for Mazarin. So the story is not completely black and white, but the story is definitely very different from the myth. And Fouquet, again, the destiny was already decided three months before the party. He spent the rest of his time in prison, died in prison. The king, after the arrest of Fouquet, barely 3 weeks after the party, took absolutely everything in the chateau. There were 150 tapestries. There were 200 statues. The orange trees. He took absolutely everything. And the collection of Nicolas Fouquet, from one day to another, disappeared pretty much to Versailles, but today, maybe scattered around the world. That was the parenthesis that I think was useful for you to know. So, in 1875, my great-great-grandfather, so Fouquet is in prison. There's going to be two families that is going to be owners of Vaux le Vicomte, and they're going to take care of the chateau and the garden until the last family, where the son is not very interested about the chateau and is going to abandon, and also for a lack of money, is going to abandon the chateau and the garden. And this is more or less, this is definitely the state of the garden where, where the nature completely overwhelmed the garden. At this point, my great-grandfather, Alfred Sommier, is buying the place. He's a wealthy industrialist person that put up his fortune thanks to the beet transforming into sugar. So thanks to the sugar industry, the chateau was saved because he visited the chateau at one day, saw the magnificent ceiling painting on the ceiling of Lebrun that were impeccable, and thought, this is a national treasure. I have to take care of it and to save it. What he did, and he dedicated the rest of his life, part of his fortune, to, yes, to, I think the resurrection is not a strong word, as you see the state of the garden. He asked Élie Lenné, who was this architect working with Hippolyte Détailleur. Hippolyte Détailleur did Waddesdon Manor. He was the architect of Waddesdon Manor close to London, and he restored the house. Élie Lenné, Alfred Sommier asked him to find, at least in the garden, the spirit of Le Nôtre. And actually, he found way more than that. He dug some earth a little bit and found all the skeleton, all the structure of the Le Nôtre garden, all the stairs, the ramps, the terraces. All the skeleton was there. So he just had to put the stones that had fallen on the side to put them together. And we have today what Élie Lenné, who is a completely unknown landscape designer and architect, did for Vaux le Vicomte in 2 campaigns, totalizing 20 to 25 years of work. In 1925, the Duchesne came to restore the first part of the garden, which are basically the bowling greens in front of the garden, so the embroidery boxwood parterre in front of the house and on both sides of the chateau. And they did, so they made this design that you can see on the right, and it's a very passionate and interesting discussion that we're having right now with architects, with garden historians, what to do with the boxwood. I'm going to tell you about the disaster we are experiencing with the boxwood at Vaux le Vicomte, and unfortunately in the rest of Europe, and on the major part of the French historical garden in France, we are losing our boxwood because of different diseases. And if you lose them, shall we just put the design of Le Nôtre, the drawing of Le Nôtre? So here there is an important discussion here, debate, I would say, between the people who think, and they're right, that the work of Duchesne was a very pioneering work of the Duchesne then influence on French formal garden during the first half of the 20th century, or do we want to pursue our aim to show to the guests, to the visitors, the house of Nicolas Foucquet, hence having the design of Le Nôtre? I'm 50-50, I have to say, with a little inclination for the Le Nôtre. The golden age of Vaux le Vicomte was definitely the 17th century, but the discussions are open. So some key figures that I go quite quickly, just to tell you it is, as Gregory was telling you, the largest private house estate classified as a historical monument. It's definitely not something that we're proud of. It's the most costly. But it is definitely a company, a corporation. We have 300,000 visitors a year. There's 70 full-time employees, and a pretty reasonable, and I would say ridiculous, budget to maintain the whole property. But we do our best to do so, of course. So some figures about the garden and the estate, and I would like to point out the number of gardeners here. And maybe Gregory Long won't be happy with that number, but I mean, we are definitely very proud that having 8 gardeners, which is pretty much 1 gardener for 4 hectares of French formal garden, and they're doing an exceptional job at Vaux le Vicomte. This is a project that we just finished last year, and because of some chestnut trees that were ill, we had to cut them. They were old and they were ill, and they were dangerous for the public, so we had to cut them and we had to replace them. We did some archaeological excavations to see whether or not if we could find some trace of the 17th century of the alignment of Le Nôtre. We did find some, but actually we did find a trench and not some tree well. And a tree well, some tree wells would have given us the space between the trees, and we didn't have that. The trenches were not long enough to have a definite alignment. So what we did, in order not to do some historical errors, we took the same alignment as my great-great-grandfather did of the late 19th century, and we planted some linden trees. Linden trees because they're disease-free and because their profile are very close to the elm trees. And elm were were the species very well used during the 17th century. And as you know, well, trees are not existing anymore, at least in Europe, because of the disease of the elm, the Dutch disease. So we plant through, it's interesting to know that it plant those trees thanks to the donation of 237 people who donate a tree, and they have their plaque and their name at the foot of the tree. This is quite new in France and in Europe. I know here it's a very common operation. It was successful, and of course it helped us a lot to be able to finance those big operations. So I was telling you about the disease of the boxwood and the box blight, of course. We don't have the box blight in France. I mean, at Vaux le Vicomte, but we have the Volutella buxi and the Cylindrocladium buxicola, and these are fungus that are developed these last year, mainly since 2013, because of the global warming, because of very mild winter, not here definitely, but for mild winter, very wet spring, and we have this proliferation of fungus, and the chemical products are not, they barely control the disease. They are disgusting for the environment, and we don't want to use them anymore. In France, we will have a law in 2017 for a zero phyto. We call this law zero phyto, which means zero use of thank you very much, thank you, because I think it's of course extremely important for our garden, extremely important for the water features and for the, for the streams that are running through the estate, and it is not the future. So what is the future? I don't know. Some Hetlu, the royal palace of Hetlu, had replaced entirely their boxwood by Ilex crenata. And Ilex crenata is very similar to boxwood, but has one small little problem. We have to trim it twice a year instead of once. And this, for the budget restriction that we have everywhere, is definitely an issue. So these are the reasons why we decided to organize this study day at Vaux le Vicomte on March 4 with the best specialists about the disease, about the research that are ongoing right now, and a discussion. We're going to have a round table, a debate around what solution for the future of those gardens. So the possible solution is to find a strong disease-free cultivar, and there's been some experiences here in the States, in North Carolina University, also in Germany, and it is too early for the moment to have, of what I know, a definitive cultivar. To replace the boxwood, which plant, and which sustainable economic solution. And the obstacle, if we find this plant, is the sufficient supply of this plant. If everyone suddenly wants this plant, there's going to be a problem of supply, and of course the enormous cost of such an operation. The other project that we're going to have this year is to restore the first phase of restoration of the statues of the garden, and we're going to do that thanks also to a fundraising program, as well as we did with the trees. And this is quite fantastic as we go, quite moving, as we are going to, in a few days' time, the restorators are going to erase the mark of 350 years of history that has on these statues. But who are we in terms of one generation to have an opinion on just a few years' time. Yes, they're going to look very white, and they're going to look very beautiful, and this is the mission that we have to carry at Vaux le Vicomte, despite what we think about the very short-term opinion we can have. We're going to replant the quinconces that we call quinquins, maybe in English or in Latin. And this is going to be planted with hornbeams and linden trees. Again, it was quite difficult to find a species that didn't have any disease and that had the profile to, that was in 17th century the profile of this parterre, of this planting area. The difficulty, so here which was very exciting to find out with the excavation, is that we found those square here that are the same, they're barely able to be seen, but they use in 300 years the same holes to plant the trees. Because the terrain is so bad, it's clay, mainly clay, so it's very difficult to plant a tree on clay, and they wanted to use the same holes in order to facilitate the growing of the tree. We're going to use pretty much the same one with the grid that is a grid of the 18th century, as it was the same grid all throughout the years because of those same holes. The difficulty here was the river I was telling you about that was crossing diagonally the estate. This river is now into a tunnel which is designed here, and we had to move of a few centimeters the grid in order not to plant on the river. This is another very exciting project, the flower bed of Foucquet, which you can see here on the left side of the picture, is also here on the engraving of the 17th century. We respect the patterns of this flower bed, but we feel very free in terms of the choose of the plant. And here Louis Benesch, who was there a few weeks ago, fantastic international renowned landscape designer, is designing the flower bed. Well, as I was telling you, as a family, yes, we have limited resources. Yes, it's difficult to have an open to the public garden with lots of different events, corporate and our own events. But it is definitely a huge privilege to be at our place today and to transmit this legacy of Nicolas Fouquet to the future generation and to celebrate the genius of this amazing cooperation of those artists that work hand in hand and that does the magic of this place, which is the fantastic harmony between landscape and the architecture. But thank you very much.